Access doesn't always disappear with a warning. Sometimes it ends quietly, no conflict, no final conversation, no visible break. One day everything feels normal, and the next, something is off. Responses lose depth, presence fades, then nothing. And the natural reaction is to search for a moment that caused it something recent, something obvious. But this kind of cutoff doesn't come from one moment. It builds over time, through repeated signals that were noticed but never argued with. Because when someone removes access without explaining, they're not reacting emotionally, they're acting on a decision that was already made long before you felt it. They stop investing where return is unclear. The decision to reduce investment doesn't appear suddenly, and it isn't driven by a single experience that stands out as the reason. It develops through repeated observation of how effort is received over time, how attention is handled, and how consistency either shows up or fails to appear. The person begins to notice that what they are giving, time, clarity, presence, attention, is not creating a stable response on the other side. Conversations may continue, interaction may still exist, but the outcome remains uneven. Effort goes in one direction with far more weight than it returns, and that imbalance becomes difficult to ignore once it has been seen clearly. The instinct is to adjust. More explanation is offered, more patience is applied, more space is given in the hope that clarity will develop naturally. The assumption is that something small is missing, something that can be corrected with a bit more attention, but when the same results repeat despite those adjustments, the conclusion becomes harder to avoid. The issue is not a lack of effort, it is the absence of consistent return. Return is not measured only in words or visible gestures. It is measured in reliability, in how someone responds without being prompted, in whether understanding is maintained without being repeatedly rebuilt. When that return is inconsistent, the investment required to maintain the connection increases. More explanation is needed, more interpretation is required, more energy is spent maintaining something that does not hold its shape on its own. Over time, that process becomes inefficient. Efficiency begins to matter more than familiarity. The person starts to recognize that continuing to invest in an unclear outcome creates a cycle where effort is constantly being reintroduced without creating stability. Each interaction requires recalibration. Each conversation feels like it needs to be rebuilt from the beginning. That pattern does not create growth, it creates repetition. Once that recognition becomes stable, behavior begins to adjust quietly. The level of effort is reduced, not as a reaction but as a correction. Fewer explanations are offered, fewer attempts are made to maintain the same level of engagement, and less energy is placed into interactions that have already shown a lack of consistent return. This change is not announced because it does not need to be. It follows directly from what has already been observed. The absence of investment reveals something that constant effort tends to hide. When effort is no longer compensating for imbalance, the true structure of the interaction becomes visible. If the other person increases their own engagement, if they move toward clarity without being guided, then something real exists beneath the previous inconsistency. If nothing changes, if the same patterns continue without the additional support, then the conclusion becomes clear without needing to be discussed. This is where selection begins to replace reaction. The person is no longer responding to each moment as it happens. They are choosing where their energy is placed based on what has already been demonstrated. That choice is not emotional. It is based on repetition, on what has been consistent over time. Investment becomes conditional on stability, not on potential. And once that condition is set, the pattern either meets it or it does not. If it does, the connection continues without strain. If it does not, the reduction in investment remains in place. There is no need to force a result or to push for a change that has not appeared on its own. The interaction settles into what it actually is, without additional effort shaping it into something else. What appears from the outside as a sudden withdrawal is simply the removal of excess effort that was previously maintaining the connection. Without that effort, the imbalance becomes visible, and the decision to step back no longer feels uncertain. It feels aligned with what has already been understood. They notice what doesn't change. Clarity begins to form when attention moves away from isolated incidents and settles on what remains consistent across time, and this changes how behavior is interpreted at a fundamental level, because the focus is no longer on what someone says in a single moment or how they present themselves under pressure, but on what continues to repeat without needing to be pointed out. The person starts to observe that certain reactions, certain tones, certain patterns of engagement appear again and again, regardless of context. And once this repetition becomes visible, it removes the uncertainty that used to keep them engaged in trying to understand each situation separately. The mind naturally looks for variation to justify continued investment, so when something positive happens, it tends to be given more weight than it should, especially when it contrasts with previous inconsistency. A clear response after a period of confusion, a moment of attention after a stretch of absence, or a brief alignment in communication can create the impression that things are changing. But when those moments are placed next to everything else that has happened, they begin to look less like change and more like interruption in a pattern that continues to return to the same baseline. This is where attention becomes more precise. The person begins to look at behavior across multiple situations rather than reacting to each situation individually. They notice how someone responds when there is no pressure to respond correctly, how they behave when no explanation is being offered, and how consistent their actions remain when they are not being guided toward a certain outcome. These observations carry more weight than anything that is said during a moment that requires performance or correction. What becomes clear is not what occasionally improves, but what consistently remains unchanged. The same lack of follow-through appears even after conversations about it. The same tone returns even after it has been addressed. The same patterns of engagement repeat even when there was an opportunity for them to shift. When these elements continue without meaningful variation, the idea that something will naturally improve starts to lose its foundation. Improvement requires change that holds over time, not change that appears briefly and disappears once attention moves elsewhere. Without that consistency, any temporary adjustment becomes difficult to trust. The person no longer evaluates behavior based on what could happen. They evaluate it based on what has already been happening repeatedly. This removes the need to question intent at every moment, because intent is already reflected in consistent action. It removes the need to revisit the same conversations, because the outcome of those conversations has already been demonstrated through repeated behavior. And it removes the need to give additional chances in the hope that something different will appear without a clear reason for it to do so. Once this level of observation is established, reactions become less immediate and more controlled. There is no urgency to respond to each instance of inconsistency because it is no longer seen as an isolated event. It is recognized as part of a larger pattern that has already been understood. That understanding creates distance internally, not as an emotional response, but as a logical outcome of what has been observed. This is where the process becomes irreversible. Because once someone clearly sees what does not change, it becomes difficult to return to a state where each moment is treated as if it exists on its own. The pattern connects everything, and that connection removes the uncertainty that once allowed continued investment. What remains is a clear picture of how things operate without needing to be explained again. They remove easy entry. The way access is managed begins to change once the person understands how easily it has been given in the past and how that ease has shaped the behavior of others over time. When entry into someone's attention, time, and internal space is always available without condition, it creates a dynamic where people learn they can come and go without adjusting how they show up. There is no requirement for consistency, no need for awareness, and no reason to consider how their presence affects the interaction because the door has always been open regardless of how they used it. That realization leads to a different approach. Access is no longer treated as something that should remain open by default. It becomes something that is managed with intent, not withheld out of reaction, but structured in a way that reflects what has already been observed. The person begins to notice that when entry is too easy, behavior tends to stay the same. There is no pressure to improve, no need to maintain a standard, and no incentive to operate with stability. So the structure changes quietly. Availability is no longer constant. Responses are no longer immediate. The depth of interaction is no longer automatic. These adjustments are not explained because they do not require explanation. They follow directly from what has already been experienced. When access has been used without consistency, it becomes limited in a way that reflects that inconsistency. This is where the difference becomes noticeable. People who were used to immediate engagement begin to encounter delay. Conversations that once moved quickly now take time to develop. Questions that previously opened long explanations now receive minimal responses or none at all. The interaction becomes more controlled, not in a visible or confrontational way, but through the absence of the usual openness. That absence creates a boundary without needing to define it. Because easy entry has been removed, anyone who wants to engage now has to operate within a different structure. They can no longer rely on the same level of access to maintain the connection. They are required to show consistency without being guided toward it, to maintain clarity without constant correction, and to respect the limits that are now in place without having them explained in detail. This is where behavior begins to separate. Some adjust to the new structure. They match the level of engagement, they respect the space, and they operate in a way that aligns with the boundaries that are now present. Others continue approaching the interaction as if nothing has changed, expecting the same level of access and becoming unsettled when it is not available. The person observes both without intervening. There is no need to correct how others respond to the new structure because their response reveals everything that needs to be understood. When easy entry is removed, what remains is behavior that reflects how someone operates without assistance. That behavior carries more weight than anything that was previously explained or adjusted for. What used to be maintained through effort is now allowed to stand on its own. If the interaction holds without constant availability, it continues. If it weakens without easy access, it reveals that the connection depended on that access to function. In both cases, the outcome becomes clear without needing to force a result. The removal of easy entry is not about creating distance for its own sake. It is about ensuring that any interaction that remains can exist without being supported by constant effort. It filters out what cannot sustain itself and leaves only what operates with consistency. And once that structure is in place, access is no longer assumed. It is either maintained through behavior or it fades without resistance. They stop matching energy. Matching energy used to be a way to maintain balance in the interaction. When someone was distant, they moved closer to keep things steady. When someone was unclear, they provided more explanation to reduce confusion. When attention dropped, they increased their own effort to keep the connection active. This pattern created the appearance of stability, but the stability was being produced by one side adjusting continuously while the other remained inconsistent. The cost of that adjustment becomes visible. Maintaining alignment through constant adaptation requires attention that never fully rests. It demands that one person tracks tone, timing, and response while compensating for gaps that should not need compensation. That level of effort can hold an interaction together for a while, but it does not create real consistency. It creates a controlled version of it, dependent on one person continuing to manage the imbalance. Once that becomes clear, the behavior changes. The person stops adjusting their energy to match what they receive. If engagement is low, they do not increase their effort to raise it. If communication becomes unclear, they do not add more explanation to compensate for that lack of clarity. If presence fluctuates, they do not stabilize it by increasing their own availability. They allow the interaction to reflect exactly what is being offered without modifying it. This changes the entire structure of the connection. Without energy being matched or compensated for, the natural level of engagement becomes visible. If the other person maintains consistency on their own, the interaction holds without effort. If they rely on the other side to keep things balanced, the connection begins to weaken because the support that once maintained it is no longer being applied. This is not about withdrawing or withholding. It is about removing the adjustment that was masking the true dynamic. Matching energy can create the impression that both sides are equally invested, even when they are not. When that matching stops, the difference in effort becomes clear without needing to point it out. The interaction either balances itself or it does not, and that outcome is more accurate than anything that could be explained. The person is no longer reacting to what is received. They are allowing what is received to define the level of engagement that follows. If communication is steady, they remain steady. If communication becomes inconsistent, their response does not expand to fill the gap. It stays aligned with what is present, not with what is missing. This removes the pressure to maintain connection through effort. There is no longer a need to elevate the interaction when it drops or to repair it when it becomes uneven. The responsibility for maintaining consistency is no longer carried by one side. It exists within the interaction itself, and if it is not there, it does not get artificially created. People notice this difference quickly. The familiar pattern of adjustment disappears. The extra attention, the additional explanation, the effort to keep everything smooth is no longer present. What remains is a more neutral form of engagement that reflects exactly what is being exchanged without enhancement. For someone who relied on that adjustment, this feels like a loss of connection. It is the removal of a process that was maintaining something that could not sustain itself naturally. Once energy is no longer matched, the interaction becomes honest, and that honesty determines whether it continues or fades. They shift from reaction to selection. A clear change develops in how decisions are made within the interaction, and it centers on moving away from responding to whatever happens in the moment toward choosing where attention and energy are placed with intent. Reaction keeps a person tied to the pace and behavior of someone else because each new message, tone, or situation becomes a trigger for engagement. Selection operates differently. It is not driven by what just occurred. It is guided by what has been consistently observed over time. When reactions lead the process, engagement feels immediate and necessary. A message arrives and it demands attention. A change in tone appears and it needs to be addressed. A misunderstanding occurs and it requires clarification. This creates a loop where the person is constantly pulled into interaction without deciding whether the interaction deserves that level of involvement. The focus stays on keeping up with what is happening rather than evaluating whether it should continue. That loop becomes inefficient. The person begins to recognize that reacting to each moment keeps them engaged in patterns that have already been understood. The same types of conversations repeat, the same outcomes appear, and the same adjustments are made to maintain a sense of balance. Nothing fundamentally changes, even though effort continues to be applied. That realization introduces a different approach. Selection replaces reaction. Engagement is no longer automatic. It becomes conditional based on what has already been demonstrated. The person evaluates whether a conversation leads to clarity or creates more confusion, whether an interaction maintains consistency or requires constant adjustment, whether the outcome aligns with what has been observed repeatedly. These evaluations happen quickly because they are based on patterns that are already familiar. This changes how responses are given. Not every message leads to a reply. Not every situation leads to involvement. Not every moment creates the need for explanation or correction. The absence of reaction is not avoidance. It is a controlled decision to invest only where there is a clear reason to do so. The person is no longer participating in every opportunity to engage. They are choosing which interactions meet a standard that justifies attention. This removes the urgency that reaction creates. There is no pressure to respond immediately, no need to fix every misunderstanding, no requirement to keep the interaction active simply because it exists. Time and energy are directed toward what holds consistency without needing to be maintained through constant input. People who are used to reactive engagement begin to notice the difference. They expect the same level of responsiveness, the same willingness to engage in every moment, the same pattern of immediate attention. When that pattern is no longer present, the interaction feels unfamiliar. Attempts to draw the person back into reaction may appear, but those attempts are met with the same process of selection. If the interaction meets the standard, it receives attention. If it does not, it remains unanswered or minimal. This approach creates a more stable structure, because selection filters out what does not align without needing to confront it directly. It allows the interaction to settle into what it actually is without being shaped by continuous reaction. What remains is engagement that exists because it is consistent, not because it is being maintained. The person is no longer controlled by what happens. They are guided by what has already been understood. The exit happens without signal. The exit does not present itself as a clear event that can be pointed to or explained in a single sentence because it is not built around one moment that defines it. It develops through a series of observations that accumulate over time, each one adding to a level of clarity that removes the need for a formal ending. By the time the absence becomes visible, the process behind it has already reached completion internally. What makes this difficult to recognize is that the interaction does not collapse all at once. It continues at a reduced level while the internal decision is being formed. Responses may still come through, conversations may still happen, and nothing appears abruptly broken. The structure is still present on the surface, but the underlying investment that once supported it is being gradually withdrawn. The person is not looking for a final confirmation or a specific trigger to justify leaving. The information needed to make that decision has already been gathered through repetition. Patterns have been observed, inconsistencies have been noted, and the overall direction of the interaction has become predictable. That predictability removes the need to wait for something new to happen. Waiting would only repeat what has already been seen. Because of that, the exit is not announced or explained in advance. Explaining it would require revisiting a process that has already been completed internally, and there is no practical value in reopening something that has already been understood. The person is not looking to create agreement or to ensure that the decision is accepted. The decision stands on its own because it is based on consistent observation rather than a single interpretation. As the internal withdrawal reaches a stable point, the external behavior begins to reflect it. Engagement becomes minimal and then eventually absent. Responses that were once consistent become infrequent and then stop. Presence that used to be reliable becomes something that is no longer offered. This progression does not include a clear signal that marks the exact moment of exit. There is no statement that defines it, no visible break that separates before and after. The transition is quiet because it does not depend on communication to be completed. For the other person, this creates uncertainty. The absence feels sudden because the internal process was not visible. There is a natural tendency to search for a recent cause, something specific that can explain why the interaction changed. That search often focuses on the last conversation or the most recent exchange, even though the decision was not formed there. It was formed across many interactions that led to the same conclusion. This is why attempts to reconnect often focus on addressing a single moment, offering an explanation, or trying to correct something that appears to have gone wrong. Those attempts assume that the exit was caused by something recent and isolated. In reality, the exit reflects a pattern that has already been evaluated as a whole. Addressing one part of that pattern does not change the overall conclusion. Because the exit is not based on a temporary reaction, it does not reverse through temporary effort. It is based on consistency, and consistency does not change through a single adjustment. For the interaction to resume in the same way, the entire pattern would need to be different, not just one moment within it. The person who has exited understands this. They are not expecting change to occur suddenly, and they are not leaving space for the interaction to continue while waiting for that change. The decision to leave has already accounted for what is likely to happen based on what has already happened. That is why the exit holds. It does not require reinforcement, and it does not depend on ongoing evaluation. It remains in place because it aligns with everything that has been observed over time. Once that alignment is reached, continuing the interaction would require ignoring that understanding, and that does not happen. What remains is a quiet absence that replaces what used to be a consistent presence. No signal was given because none was needed. Access doesn't end with noise. It disappears with clarity. Nothing dramatic has to happen for someone to step out completely. When patterns become predictable and effort stops producing anything stable, the decision finishes quietly. No announcement, no explanation. Just the absence of everything that once made the connection feel active. That's why it feels sudden, because the process wasn't happening in front of you. Every interaction was already being measured, every inconsistency was already understood. And once the outcome became clear, continuing didn't require discussion, it required execution. So when access is gone without warning, when there's no response, no engagement, no return, don't look for a final moment. Look at everything that made the ending inevitable. Because once someone decides with clarity, they don't explain the exit. They complete it.